Tim trained in physics, University of Chicago, PhD in electrical engineering from MIT. So he's pretty good, reasonably pedigreed. And I got to know him while he was at Medtronic, where he was the VP of Research. It was really just instrumental, and in fact, he's going to use my slides. Instrumental in our early work in these next generation devices. And then I had a call one day, and he was like, I'm moving to Oxford. They were very smart. They wanted to create a neurotechnology. They wanted to create a neurotechnology. And so where did they go? Well, they go to someone who really knows how to do that. And I think we'll see how Tim does that. I saw in the news that the UK just gave his group 50 million pounds to create that future. So, yeah, Tim.
So I guess they asked for the tale of two translations commercially, but then I didn't know which two you're talking about. And so I actually took more of a thing, rhythms of life, rhythms of innovation. And I hope this will become clear. I do have a number of disclosures. I was actually brought over to the UK post-Brexit. And so they created the chairs in emerging technology, which is actually very interesting. So the cooler heads in the UK government said when Brexit occurs, we have to actually build the economy in the UK. And so every year they were getting 8 to 10 people in different areas of technology to come in. And so I'm actually paid by the UK government to build industry. Publications are secondary thought. It's actually my metric of success is actually growing the economy. It's actually fun. I kind of think of us like the Knights of the Round Table when we get together, because there's about 50 of us across all these different areas trying to build up the economy. And so that's my primary funder. Because of my conflicts, take everything I say with a grain of salt. And I will be talking about investigational devices. So just to reinforce, I like to start thanking my collaborators. These are both academics. That's the lab I'm building up on the top left. But a lot of the energy actually comes with working with clinicians. So these are my two Amber co-founders, Charlie and Stefan, looking at incontinence. I work with a number of industries. TMS, that's the MagStem R&D team in Wales. That's a prototype for a power electronic circuit that we built. And then also vets, I lifted from Greg's playbook, working with veterinarians to try out devices. And then the factory where we assemble devices. But the other thing, we won't talk as much about it, but since getting to the UK is thinking a lot about emerging markets and how do we really help the people who are truly underserved, something we don't talk a lot about in Neurotech conferences, and I think it's a big gap. So I do a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa now as well. So we've heard a lot about the sci-fi elements and the excitement, but I think it's fun. Some of us were inspired as children in science fiction and comics, but I put this up because this is from 1958. So these ideas have been around for quite some time. And so this is the brain amplifier. If one of us at the Mayo Clinic could just come up with the missing ingredient, we can increase our thought process by a factor of 100. And I actually think that's was brought up earlier with AI. What can we do to improve your clinical capabilities by a factor of 100? But we just need that missing ingredient. The crooked ex-scientist or automotive executive trying to figure out how to loot the world. And so one of the things that I think a lot about is that missing ingredient from my standpoint as an engineer. I think we all understand why it's important. This is a snapshot from the EU. Just the EU alone, the top row is the number of millions of people in any given year suffering from these conditions. The middle row is the cost to treat them in euros. And then the bottom is the summary aggregate cost for disease state. So in the areas of Parkinson's disease, where brain technology that I work on, DBS is probably its most successful, but still it's very heavily underpenetrated. It's still only 15%. So Cameron might talk a bit about this as well tomorrow. One of our goals is what can we do to improve the penetration of these device technologies in Parkinson's, but at the same time actually adopt that technology and move it across into areas that might even have a larger societal impact, such as dementia, addiction, mood disorders, and anxiety. So that's the frame of why it's important to find this ingredient. Whenever I talk to my students in engineering, they always say, well, why not pharma? They think of pharma first. This is a graph. It was actually just adjusted by the economists, so the trend continues. The slope has improved a bit, but I'll have you note this is a plot of on the y-axis, the number of drugs released for $1 billion of US investment. That's a logarithmic scale, and then time going by. And so right around the turn of the millennium, $1 billion of investment would get you a new drug. So the pharmacists, not me, make fun of themselves. I call this E-Room's law. And so E-Room is Moore's law, spelled backwards. So they see themselves as moving backwards for innovation. While you look at semiconductors, this is a chip. My friend at IMEC in Belgium made this for me. And it's a chip the year I was born and how it would have scaled over time. And so that same functionality going by over the years. And you may look at this and say, well, what happened in 2014? Innovation stopped. It no longer fits on a pixel. So you just can't even draw it anymore. And so as an engineer, thinking about what we see as the evolution of Moore's law and semiconductors over time as a complement to pharma, not to replace pharma, to complement pharma, what can we do to apply Moore's law and scale it for therapies? So the vision, this gets into a business. I think good businesses are driven by an overarching vision that's a little more timeless, has been to take bioelectronics and think what can we do to actually restore physiology. And that's getting into the themes that are coming out of the BIONIC initiative here. So I go back also to about the time I was born where cybernetics was kicking off in the UK, a nod to Kai's lab name. And they had started with a good regulator theorem. So the thought of Ashby was that if you want to build a good regulator for a system, it needs to inherently be a model of that system. So we've heard about responsive systems. Physiology does have feedback mechanisms, but it also has feed forward, embodied in Circadian, which I'm very sensitive. Right now it's 1:20 a.m. and where I'm from, so it's a tough go. We'll slog through it. So when we're thinking about devices, you've heard multiple times tonight about closed loop. So we need closed loop systems, responsiveness, and that's where a lot of investment has gone in industry in the last 20, 30 years. But I want to do a detour, and one of the things that's changed in my perception since I've gone to England is thinking about nature and other elements of rhythms. And so I picked up beekeeping as a hobby. I kind of become a bit obsessed with it. And this is a plot of actually multiple years of the weight in a bee colony. And so this is telling you about the resources. Basically, it's how much honey is available to get energy from the bees. And now you'll note that there's this cycle, an oscillation, just like what Greg's showing in brain rhythms, but on a yearly scale. But the bees do something that's actually a little bit risky. So right around the winter solstice, the queen starts to actually lay more and more eggs. So there's no nectar, there's no pollen, but they're putting themselves at great risk to actually start to build the colony. And what's going on is they're preparing for the nectar flows. So in order to have the critical mass for the bees to take advantage of the nectar, if they're in the short window of time that the nectar is available, they have to prepare for months ahead. It takes 3 weeks to grow a new brood, and you need the new brood to help to raise the next brood. It's a kind of a geometrical progression. Feedback is too slow. They can't wake up in the hive one morning and say, oh, the nectar's here, let's go gather it. They have to prepare. And so physiology has actually built this in. We've evolved, and humans as well, to take advantage of the predictive element of the rhythms. The planet goes around its axis at a certain rate, we go around in the seasons. This, I think, is an area of general opportunity in bioelectronic medicines. If you look at different disease states, they certainly have certain chronotypes, and getting in and intervening on sleep-wake cycles and trying to reinforce them as dealing with the comorbidity of many disease states, I think is an untapped opportunity for us in bioelectronics. A real-time clock costs about $1. Why are we not exploiting that in devices today? So that's why I add in the vision of adding both predictive elements as well as responsive. And then similar to the themes of BIONIC, the BIONIC initiative is in the near term, think about therapy optimization, but long term, can we actually break some of these cycles that we see by tapping in, say, reinforcing, reestablishing circadian rhythms. Now, I do like this quote from Edison. There's a lot of visions that float around in bioelectronics. If we don't execute on it, that's just hallucination. And so we haven't really talked too much about these other axes this evening. It gets into the business side. But we have to really balance multiple constraints. And this is where I say, for me, this is the missing ingredients oftentimes for building the brain amplifier and technologies. There's always, starting on the right, what I think we do well in an academic space of identifying clinical needs, looking at the science, and thinking about the technical maturity. What we don't do as well on is the left-hand side, thinking about the economics and making it viable, thinking about workflow viability. Engineers are notorious. As clinicians, the most damning feedback I can get is designed by engineers for engineers. And so it doesn't really track its way into the clinic for adoption. And then, of course, thinking carefully about regulatory pathways. All this grounded, of course, on an ethical foundation for our patients. So this is the thought of the missing ingredients. But now it's also easy to draw this figure. So you'd sit here at Medtronic, or sit here at my startups and say, all right, well, is it economically viable? Well, I don't know. How well is it going to work? Well, I don't know how well it's going to work until I build one. Well, it's going to cost $50 million to build one. Where am I going to get that investment? So the actual calculus of how you go about doing this is really kind of my core message for the rest of the talk. And this is my approach to it. It's not the only approach. It's just one approach, but it's kind of a playbook that I've worked through in a few cases. I'm going to walk you through it. So just like in biology there's rhythms, I think it's also important to understand business and products tend to have rhythms as well. Because of the technology life cycle. So you might have seen this technology S-curve. So going, time once again is going by on the x-axis. And we have performance measures for a given technology. So Uderbeck, who I like, he kind of studied this. So he said there's a discontinuous technological change, like a transistor arrives, and we get to ride up that S-curve. And we start out with this area of ferment, where we don't know what the design's going to look like. We're all prototyping, trying out ideas, like Kay's example of BCIs. We don't know what the right answer is. But then once we get a sense of the product, then we're going to do for process innovation as we optimize the way it's built. And then eventually we move over to incrementalism. So a lot of incremental work gets done. Each one of these stages is important and has its role. And so it's important to kind of recognize the value that each one of those brings. So stepping back to building these regulators, thinking about good regulators, and with that idea of technology life cycles, I'd almost say the 1990s till about now, I would say we were kind of stuck in incremental neuromodulation, where I don't like to say it's open loop, because open loop would be use clinicians, send the patient out into the real world and say, good luck. There is a closed loop. It's just you as the clinical community. You are the human in the loop. We actually didn't conspire on our slides. This is reinforcing principles from earlier. There's a human in the loop that's actually doing the job of manually controlling the stimulator, doing these periodic adjustments on the order of every 3 months in the case of Oxford, and trying to fine-tune the system. Now we're in the area of ferment. So we try to add the automaticity, where there's still a human involved, of course, but they're now on the loop. They're monitoring the way that the device is configured. And like a thermostat in your home, we can actually set a set point and have the device automatically go from, say, from every month to month an adjustment to now on the order of seconds. And then once again reinforcing that their role for feed forward as well, just like our circadian rhythms and other rhythms, we can include that in the device design. But, and it gets into that earlier question on regulation, as we move from clinicians in the loop, controlling an open loop device, to the automated closed loop systems, it brings up new questions and risks. And this is from Tori Marks, who's a Mayo grad. She's been studying this and coming up with checklists for the community. And some of these questions are, what is the nature of the input signal? As we just heard about BCI, those biomarkers. What about artifacts that we have to work around? What about cardiac or motion artifacts? How can those throw off your algorithm? Thinking carefully about the set points and the way we actually design the closed loop system itself. And of course, safety, looking out for our patients. So just like your automated cars now can be fooled, drive into walls, what do we do to prevent similar occurrences from happening with an automated medical device? So how do we go about solving this problem? So I think to think about this as an engineer working with the clinician partners and the regulators is coming up with the catalyst. So I think what's missing in Utterback's model is that oftentimes before there's the technology innovation, there's a scientific discovery that's made. So in the case of spinal cord stimulation, which helped launch our field, is really looking back at the gate control theory. It helped to inspire the CASE team to actually go about and design their first generation spinal cord stimulator for chronic pain. So how do we get those major scientific insights that drive the technology? But at the same time, how can the technology that we have help to catalyze that next generation of discovery? And so that involves both a product innovation and a process innovation, I think, and that's what I'm going to walk you through, kind of the roadmap of how we design products. So process and platform, we have a vision. So the first step is we map that into a research platform. And it has two components. The first is a kind of tried and true existing neurostimulation platform. And what that does is it gives the patients and the clinicians confidence that they'll get the therapy that they expect. Then at the top, we have a scientific instrumentation platform. So it kind of gets bolted on top, and we can use this to do translational research. And so the model is, patient comes into the clinic, they need to get a therapy. You can offer them that baseline therapy with the existing stimulator's capabilities, but if they so choose, they can enter into a study, you can wake up the instrumentation toolkit, explore, and then the nice thing about digital technology is that successes that you see from biomarkers, algorithms, stimulation patterns can actually be used and inserted into the next generation platform. So if done correctly, the idea is to have a virtuous feedback cycle where we can continuously learn over time. So in my own work with the team, a large and very talented team at Medtronic, we were able to work on the Activa PC+S. The name actually reinforces this. It was an Activa PC plus the science toolkit. And this was aligned with the BRAIN Initiative, and then we could provide tools for computers in the loop and prototyping algorithms such as the Nexus system. And our scientific competitors were NeuroPace, Marty Morell and her team at NeuroPace. And this was a great time back in the 2000s, the earlier 2000s. And the timing was exceptionally right. We got a phone call from the White House and basically went to kick off the NIH BRAIN Initiative. And what was great was Tom Insel, who is the director of the National Institutes of Mental Health at that time, said, in pharma, we actually go and support drugs that are on the shelf and make them available to the outside community. And we help to fund the research, we help to negotiate the intellectual property rights, and there's a pathway then for new indications for drugs to actually see it out into the clinic. Do you think we could do the same thing with devices? And so Tom gave me that challenge. I went back to Medtronic and actually the other large companies. We said, yes, we'd be able to do that as long as the FDA got involved, because before you didn't really want to talk about what was next because that could be seen as off-label promotion. So he says, the FDA is on board for releasing advanced technologies. You can help to create an ecosystem. The NIH funded a lot of foundational research like that at the Mayo and epilepsy. And this network actually helped to pull together and really bring together what I think was a fantastic ecosystem. And no matter your thoughts, I think there's a great role for actually the government to bind people together and bring the best of government, best of regulations, the best of academics, and the best of industry, and actually working together as a group, we can advance therapies. For me, the highlight of the BRAIN Initiative professionally was the Parkinson's device, the ADAPT trial, which was just FDA approved and CE marked. And that was actually the culmination, for me, of the BRAIN Initiative. Because what they did was they took a concept that had been prototyped in a clinic more than a decade ago, but they worked out all the practical issues of really getting it into a home environment. So instead of just one university, how does it go across 20 universities? There's a lot of statistical variance. Where do the surgeons put the electrodes? How do we deal with all these issues? Artifacts. What's the right algorithm to use? Ended up the Oxford algorithm did not hit a clinical endpoint. It was the one that was developed with the BRAIN Initiative that ultimately got it across the finish line. So in the absence of the BRAIN Initiative funding, most likely it would have been a failed trial and have set the field back by decades. So that's the generation one. Historically, my family, my forebear, George Denison, lived in Roxbury, Massachusetts about 400 years ago, and then his first wife died, and he walked from her funeral to the shipyard, took a boat back to England, joined Cromwell's army because he didn't know what to do, and at the Battle of Naseby got shot off of his horse, and he recovered in a farmhouse, and that's where he met my grandmother, and then he came back. And so I'm in that kind of journey of off in the wilderness in England back again. So I call this ecosystem 2.0. And, but now the key of the ecosystem 2.0 is we kind of stepped into the product innovation and the process. Now we want to very intentionally do it within the UK ecosystem. So one of the key differences is that on the Activa PC+S, it was designed by the engineers at Medtronic with some inputs from clinicians, but a lot of it was, Greg, Matt, okay, Kai, here you go, write your algorithm, write your protocols around it. One of our key elements here was to actually, from the beginning, design the system as a joint company and academic collaboration. And so actually, because it's a small company, we had access to all of the firmware, we actually had the circuit designs, things that actually I could see a large strategic not necessarily wanting to do, but we have the benefit of being in a smaller ecosystem. And so it was really kind of a joint development. And that includes both the hardware, but also critically, we call the dynamic neuromodulation system, where we could look at posture, bioelectric signals, and also these circadian rhythms, and see what kind of therapies can we develop. So one of the key things about our innovation pipeline is focusing on therapies where we think we can have a lifetime effect. So we've gone in terms of pediatric epilepsy, looking at the design of a device to help children down to the age of 5, really trying to change their life and their family's trajectory, and then also post-stroke chronic pain. So steering a little bit in my area away from Parkinson's, where there's degeneration, and really in ones where the disease is a bit more static. We might be able to have a lifetime impact. And that's what I put in red, is being part of a socialized healthcare system where we really worry about quality of life adjusted years per pound. We never talk about our electrode counts. We never talk about that. Nobody cares. So it's like, I want to put a little button when I come to the US to go to the neuro meetings. It's quality per pound stupid, because that's how we're judged by the NHS. So I get 25,000 pounds for every quality adjusted life year. If I can do a technology that meets that, I can get on the NHS. If I miss that economic input, I got to go back to the drawing table. So just about a year ago, the BBC ran the story of Oren. He's the young man at the far right, and he has Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and so he's our lead user for the device in the cadet pilot. So that was just to get the basic safety figured out in up to 4 children. And we've now finished up the pilot. Now we're moving on to the trial, which is a proper blinded trial to get the evidence in place for the NHS. The other thing, and I'll lead into this, is kind of with my UCL team, the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, we're working on exploring different algorithm principles, sorted out with standard open loop manual stimulation. And we're trying 2 adaptive modes. One is to layer on top of that, similar to what NeuroPace is, responsive stimulation. So if there's a breakthrough seizure, can we take some emergency action? But also critically, we see this especially in some of our children and all of our epilepsy patients, is the adaptive mode of doing things differently throughout the day versus night based on their specific chronotype. And so exploring these different layers of algorithms. Now I have a point on this of kind of a static mode, a responsive mode, and circadian rhythms, is that this allowed us to go from areas like the brain, but also out into the periphery. And so with the Genesis area focusing on the end organs, as a little side project, with two of my buddies, Charlie and Stefan, we said, hey, we got this device for epilepsy, why don't we look at mixed urinary incontinence? And you've got this urge side of it, so static kind of stimulation. We've got stress component, which is a responsive mode. And there's a circadian element to the incontinence. I said, hey, we basically change a few lines of code in the electrode, and we have a device for mixed urinary incontinence. So that earlier point on being organic, I think you got to pivot. So that little side project led to $100 million of investment, and the little academic team that was using bioinduction and fine tech medical, we ended up buying them all out. And so that's the Amber Therapeutics. And the key message for the clinical communities with the engineering teams, you could kind of build this ecosystem and infrastructure and very rapidly be able to try out different therapies with that toolkit. So take-home points that I'd like you to walk away with. First, I think we'd all agree this is a problem worth the effort. It's a complementary approach to pharma. There's a good opportunity there for us, and I think ultimately it's actually devices with pharma and other elements will be the ultimate therapies. I will want to reinforce we need a translational mindset. So it's multiple constraints. So it's not just the science, it's not the technology, the unmet need, but thinking from the beginning on the economics, workflow viability, and the regulatory pathway. You may not agree with me, but also part of the reason I wanted to go to the NHS was it's a very constrained economic ecosystem. So learning how to design therapies within that ecosystem, I think puts one at a great advantage coming back to the United States. You've got 4 to 5 quality per pound, in terms of your threshold. I don't know if that's always great for the US healthcare system. I'll save the rest of that for the bar. Part of it, you already heard it earlier, how can we actually create the ecosystem for translation? I think there's that element of thinking about life cycles and what can we do, to Greg's point, about pulling in the time so it doesn't have to be so long, but thinking carefully about how do we compress that x-axis and bring in time. And that can be done in a number of ways. The way I like to think about it is building the research tools as well as the process for the clinical research to try to accelerate that. So then you asked for 2, and I was going to say maybe third time's the charm. So this is another Midwesterner who lived in Oxford in England for a bit, T.S. Eliot, the poet. And I do think this is a bit of like these cycles as we go through them. We will not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. And I want to reinforce this. The PC+S was the first go around. Didn't say, boy, we made some real mistakes. Then we've done the Dynamo, and we said, okay, we've made some mistakes. And one of the things that we want to go into in the future, kind of in this next generation, is very much aligned with what the BIONIC initiative is trying to do. We said historically neuromodulation devices were thinking about palliative care, treating symptoms, but what can we do to actually get into the circadian cycles or deal with plasticity and the like and leverage that to try to slow and ultimately perhaps stop or reverse degeneration. And that's what this new $50 million grant is. And actually, the UK government did me a solid where they announced it this morning so I could talk about it tonight. So with that, I will close. Take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I think we have some time for some questions. I love it that it went focused on the brain and then ended up on the bladder. The things I really worry about is designing for the bladder and then trying to take that to the brain.
So it's actually interesting. So one thing, Earl, I had the privilege with Earl Bakken. I got to know him quite well in his later years. And one of the things that always drove Earl a little bit to distraction was how we partition the body up into these segments. Yeah. And it really annoyed him. And the key letter of recommendation that we got for our first grant was from the Dementia Research Institute in the UK for the bladder program. And they actually track my research. I go and report to the DRI, every year. And they said the reason is, at least in the UK, yes, dementia is a problem, but the 2 reasons people go to the care homes, get kicked out of the family, is they become violent or they become incontinent. And those are the 2 kind of thresholds where the family just says, we just can't take care of our loved one anymore, we have to get them out. And so that's the one of, like, even incontinence, it's a big issue, even in areas like with brain health.
I kind of see, there we go. Yeah. 3 different worlds of what I would call device ecosystem plans going on right now, right? So one would be the traditional corporate-based, company. I'm developing my own IP, my own platform, whatever you want to call it. The other would be something like what you have done while you've been at Oxford. I would say that you're building your own independent ecosystem in kind of a public-private partnership. I'm not exactly sure what the exact rules of it are, but you got your own thing going. And then there is this, let's say, the new kid on the block, and I would use the example of like Kevin Kilgore, and I don't know exactly what they call it, but let's just call it open source neuromodulation platform, right? And I can see value in all 3 of these different scenarios, but I think whatever comes out of that is going to be very relevant to what they're trying to do here, right? And so if you would, I'd like you to kind of maybe talk about the pros and cons of these 3 different, sort of strategies to developing clinical grade neurotech.
Yeah, it's a good question. I am watching the clock, which I appreciate you putting up on the wall. So I'll give the abbreviated version, and we can follow up over the happy hour. So with the major companies, a lot of it is the closed platform. So it's almost the Apple approach, and that, like Apple, that can have a lot of advantages of fully controlling your ecosystem. There's IP related with that. I'm going to go to Kevin's approach, and that's because it actually sets it back to maybe it's the 3 bears. I'm trying to get it just right. So there's the Spark initiative where they have two initiatives where it's more of an open source platform. For me, the trick is, one, the FDA has to have a manufacturer of record. And so at an academic center, are they willing to sign up to take the liability of being the manufacturer of record? Frankly, I think a lot of universities don't even know what that means. It's about quality management systems and the like, and being audited by the FDA. The FDA, many of you know the nice side of the FDA. I know the other side of the FDA, where they show up unannounced wearing guns, and they're there to do an audit. And so that's the enforcement side of the FDA. And so you have to be ready to deal with both if you're the manufacturer of record. And I also spend a lot of time with these investigational tools about long-term care and support. And that's the other thing that makes me nervous, is that in an academic community, we go through, by definition, we train people. So they're coming in, they're cycling. The people who developed the product and released it, will they be there to support it 5, 10 years from now when they need a replacement part? So what we were trying to do is find the happy balance of having a company who would actually own the quality management system, be the manufacturer of record, but who is open to collaborate with the academics and help to support the research and the like. But then, the disadvantage there, then IP has to be figured out. Like you say, there's a lot of challenges to get the IP correct. We did come up with a reasonable collaboration agreement that works well for us under UK law. In the US, it would have to be slightly different, but that's the relative trade-offs. The issue of the little companies, it's hard to scale. So the nice thing with Medtronic, Boston, Abbott, they can supply things at scale. This is a little shop. And so it is, that was Anna at the welder. And so she's got to weld each of the can lids on. And so, there are kind of constraints for each one of these. As of right now, I think it really depends on the specific thing you're going after. Ultimately, if you want to scale up a therapy, I think there is something to be said for you move it to a strategic partner who has the sales force and the support. But where we struggle is in new therapies like OCD, Tourette, even pediatric epilepsy and the like. a lot of the major strategics don't want to take on the risk. They want you to prove out the therapy and that it's viable and the like. And so that's why I think these other two, the smaller ones, the open source model or this kind of hybrid model, have their role as well for the early stage therapy discovery, that ferment time where you don't know what the right answer is yet. Yeah, so there's kind of the three stages: the early ferment, the process, and the scale. I almost would say there's a diffusion of, to stick to my time, I cut slides. There's a diffusion of innovation kind of model that they use. And so there's the early adopters. You're the early adopters. In fact, you're the bleeding edge of the early adopters. You live in a fantasy land. So it's like, I mean, that's the part of like, you're my worst design inputs, because you're like, you'll throw every resource. I mean, the first time I came to the Mayo from Oxford, I said, you ever think about low and middle income countries? And I give you credit because you said no. You said, we focus on complex care that requires 20 clinicians working together. I said, well, you understand your strategy, which I fully respect. But I think for us to push therapy, so for Mayo to have that global presence, you have the area of ferment, but then you have to move it to process, and the incrementalism, it actually gets back to the point on the AI and kind of these clinical assist tools. That's a great opportunity. Like when you want to go at scale across the planet, what can you do? When Matt Stead and Greg Worrell came and we were talking about algorithms, so my goal is to put sensors and algorithms inside of a device so Greg Worrell and Matt Stead are available to the entire global community. And so that's within the areas like the process, and that don't think about it like incremental from the standpoint of it's not important. What it's doing is it's taking the best know-how of the Mayo Clinic, packaging it in a way that it can actually then be made accessible. So a community neurologist armed with this technology, and I grew up in West Virginia, so I can say, in West Virginia, Parkersburg, West Virginia, has the know-how and the skills that they have at the Mayo Clinic. And so I don't think there is one. It's just, like this is the area I'm focusing on. But if anything, in my academic, I don't think we spend enough time on the process and the scale-up side. We just do with the early adopters because, that gets us Nature publications. So if that's your metric of success, then probably the early ferment is the area. But for global healthcare and scaling up and having an international presence in the actual treatment of patients, pushing on the process and that incremental scale-up, I think, is also an amazing opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks. I actually want to thank Kai and Greg for suggesting you. It was a really thought-provoking presentation. And much of what you said resonates with me, and I think with the concept of BIONIC, that together with Sean, we talk about this quite a bit. I do like the fact that you ended up on this slide, Dr. Shah, for the £50 million that MRC gave you. But I just wanted to ask, do you think that's sufficient for the vision that you have? Build the basis, understanding you need a much larger budget, but then build that basis to attract additional support, as you said, to impact the economy, that kind of provides you that sort of feedback to, in fact, build bigger.
Yeah, it's actually, so you don't know you've answered your own question by the way you ended it. So this, actually what's funny for this money, it's for infrastructure. So this actually doesn't cover research. It's literally $50 million to build infrastructure across multiple universities. So in both England and Wales and a bit of Scotland. And I won't, over wine, I can tell you why Northern Ireland and all this, there's funny politics there too. But it's really kind of building up an ecosystem across multiple universities. And that's part of it. It's a culture change. It used to maybe something for Mayo, we're hearing about Cleveland Clinic, like I won't push it. But historically it was Oxford had a center, Cambridge has a center, and the MRC actually said, we're done. They canceled all units. They said we're going to end all unit structure in the United Kingdom, and we're going to create centers of research excellence that actually have multiple universities coming together. So this is to fund the infrastructure for this. And then with this infrastructure, we're expected to go out and team up and get much larger grants and cumulatively a much larger grant pool in order to get the full ambition of the project. So this is just literally to set up basically what you'd say is your BIONIC infrastructure. And then with that ecosystem in place, you can go and get both companies. So this includes companies from the small companies to the Medtronics and the hopefully Bostons and Abbotts of the world, but also the small academics and the regulators.
I really enjoyed the talk, and you've got my neurons jumping. But you had a slide there of your multiple constraints, and you were saying that we're, as kind of researchers and scientists and clinicians and living up in the cloud, we're very good on the right side, but on the left side, we're not so good.
I won't speak for the Mayo Clinic. My Oxford
do you ever use, when you're trying to figure out, obviously, as you said, we're hearing about so many ideas. And at the end of the day, in order for us to be successful, we're going to have some winners. How do you kind of look at an opportunity, and do you use that multiple constraints diagram to start? Do you score things when you look at a potential project and say, do you have a kind of a swimmer chart where you have colors and numbers, a scoring system, and if you don't score, maybe you can score badly in one of the 6 components, but you kind of have to have is there some simplistic way of using what you've shown us to try and at least say, this is a no-go?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm looking at Kai. This is the next companion paper we're working on with Gerwin Schock as actually kind of a scoring metric. So we are working to mature that and publish it. I do have a version of it that I use for helping to make decisions. And like one of those is, like I made a reference to it, will we have a long-term patient care trajectory? Right now, part of my scoring, it's a personal choice, we've been staying away from degeneration because we say with neuromodulation today, I think it's fair to say, that showing any kind of trajectory change is weak, if there's any evidence for it. And so I was looking for things like chronic pain, epilepsy, where we can have a longer term. So that's part of my score, but also that gets into the economics. So there's an economic, I talk to the healthcare economics people and say, do we have the quality of life adjustment measures that we can gather as part of the pilot trials, map that into something I can provide the evidence for the NHS, thinking about the regulatory pathway. We have kind of, so UK is the size of California and Texas, just for rough numbers. And so that's what's nice is it's critical mass, but it's also small. So I know the MHRA people, I know all of the reviewers, and we work together quite a bit and kind of work through what's the regulatory pathway, what are the constraints, and making sure that that's there. And then the other one though is an access pathway. So one of the things I think a lot about, there's a lot of interest in inflammation with bioelectronic medicine. Several companies are going after that. And talking to my colleagues who are in that space, I can't speak for the Mayo clinicians, but certainly for Oxford, the people who do rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, they would never think about a vagal nerve stimulator. So there's a whole access point of how do you educate the community, get the thought of an implant of a bioelectronic system. Who's going to manage that? They're setting up the stimulation pathway. So Earl Bakken actually had a checklist like this as well. And so it was like, and he would actually ask himself personally, do I know the clinician who's going to prescribe this therapy? Like, do I know them? Do I know the person, the clinician who's going to do the follow-up for that patient? And so some of these practical, that's the workflow side of it, in terms of, is the pathway in place? Because it's an opportunity, but it also can be a barrier. And Mayo is the kind of place that can help to address that. But, at other community hospitals, if you have to cross multiple disciplines to actually get access to that therapy, certainly it doesn't have to stop you, but you have to start thinking about how you're going to deal with that barrier. So there's a checklist you can put together, but the wheel's a good starting point.